Welcome to the place of rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of our times. My name is Jonathan Boyce, and it's my pleasure to bring to you today's episode. Virginia invited forensic neuropsychologist Dr. Judy Ho to discuss her work and new book regarding attachment theory. Together, they bring hope to the topic as they discuss the new rules of attachment. We hope you enjoy today's conversation.
I am so thankful, Dr. Judy, that you were able to join me today.
Oh, I'm so excited to be with you, Virginia. We have lots to talk about.
Yes, we do. Of specific interest to me is this topic of attachment, because I think it's something practical and accessible in helping people displace the confusion and chaos that often derails their best intentions, and explains also how they show up for relationships. So I have several questions for you today that I'm excited to hear you respond to. The foundations of our work on attachment are in alignment with my work, because I think attachment theory most basically explains our reactivities and how we show up, right, in life and for relationships. At R.E.S.T, attachment is a key part of understanding ourselves and how we respond to others or react to others. So with that, what prompted you to get into this line of work and, to write a whole book on this?
Well, Virginia, like we talked about right before we press record, we're probably kindred spirits, and attachment just is so foundational to our existence as human beings. The way that we come into the world, we're coming to the world trying to soak up everything that we can from our environment. And also we come into the world basically helpless. We need to rely on the adults in our lives to take care of us, to help us to survive and thrive. And so these attachment bonds, these early relationships that we have with the people who are our primary caretakers, it tells us everything about who we think we are and what people are likely to do when we ask for help. And these early messages turn into rules that we use for life, even into adulthood, even when our circumstances change, just because they were so foundational to our understanding as human beings.
What specifically in your course of study, what was the one thing about the research on attachment that spans, I think now over 70 years, and it's very consistent with a low margin of error? In other words, the behavior is pretty predictable when you understand the framework of somebody's developmental years, what happened in the home, story of their parents, and how they interacted and connected with the parents. But what was something specific that when you really dove deep into this subject that really went, boom, that is irrefutable?
I think it's that self-concept and the way that we think about ourselves. So that includes your self-image, your self-esteem, your ideal self, all of these projections of who you are. All of that is based in your attachment relationships. And I think that when you look at social media, when you look at online articles, sometimes there is such a huge focus on how attachment relates to romantic relationships, which of course is an important impact of attachment. But I feel like they're missing the whole picture, you know? And the whole picture is that it's all about the belief in yourself. And that's what attachment's really about. And of course, then it radiates out to your relationships, but it radiates out to other things as well. And so I think that that was really the clincher for me.
We often say that our stories didn't begin at home, but they began in the home of our parents' parents' parents. It's one of these things I find myself referring to all the time, because sometimes we really mirror so much of the behavior of how we were perceived or how our parents interacted with one another, and as a consequence how they responded to us. But our parents come from these homes, so there's these generational dynamics that are passed on, right, from generation to generation. And that's central to my work. I deal with issues of psychoneuroimmunology and the interconnectedness, right? So attachment is a small part of my work, but I'd say it is a cornerstone of it because of this continuum, if you will, of dynamics that are passed on, right? Could you discuss this specifically as it relates to your statement in the book about intergenerational transmission of attachment styles?
Yeah, definitely. And I know that this is so core to your work as well. It's not really so much about being obsessed necessarily about exactly, how your past informs your current and future, but you have to acknowledge it. And I think that this intergenerational transmission of attachment styles, it's so automatic for most of us. Some of the things that we've probably fought the most and, reacted to the most as children, somehow as adults, oftentimes, again, without reflection, without acknowledgement, will oftentimes turn into our own rules and our own ways of approaching parenting, right? And so I think that there's really two usual responses that I often see. Either there's certain things about your childhood that you didn't like and you swore to be the complete opposite. And so in that way, maybe it's helpful, but also at extreme, maybe not so much because then it makes you super rigid about doing something completely differently. But I think more often than not, there's these things that you say you didn't like about your childhood, but then as you start your own family and as a parent, you start to adopt some of these strategies yourself. And it's not your fault, it's just how core the things that you're exposed to as children can be to your development if you don't say, okay, what is the healthy way to move past this and to kind of take all the information together, the pros and cons, and think about a healthy way to break out of that. But that takes work and that takes conscious thought. And so many of us are in some ways operating automatically in a lot of our lives without that acknowledgement.
Yeah. And it does, I love how you framed that. And it also takes a willingness to displace ignorance, which is not having information, right?
Right.
When we're ignorant about something, it's not an assault on us or somebody else. It's just there's information that's missing. I use this biofeedback technology, and we're going to have fun when we meet. We're going to talk about all kinds of stuff that I don't want to make our listening audience crazy, but some of the my background's in neuroscience from UCI. So I've always been fascinated by the brain, but my fascination with the brain led me to just the become very curious about the physiological constitution of psychological dilemmas, conflicts, challenges, right? So with attachment, we see the connection between the central nervous system and our behavior. But something that I have found fascinating, and I'll share with you, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, but our listening audience may be dealing with and not be aware of, is that I have a way of finding and articulating and pointing out where that conflict came generationally and who it came from. Because when I do voice frequency documentation and they're speaking about their mom or their dad or their grandmother, their grandfather, the great-grandmother, great-grandfather, it's very interesting because there'll be a consistency in frequencies in terms of specific organs, specific feelings, specific emotional, outputs that are consistent with those specific people generationally. It's fascinating. So it helps displace a measure of ignorance where they're not the person, for example, that is a chaotic attachment style. They don't have to carry the shame necessarily of, for example, the measure of dysfunction. I don't like that word, but whatever. The maladaptive tendencies that came from that family, they don't have to carry the shame of that. When we can identify the story, the narrative, and who it's connected to and with. Have you done any work in that area with people? Do you know anything about that, or the DNA and the strains of DNA and who it's connected to in particular family systems? Have you done anything like that, or are you familiar with any research in that?
Yeah, just very generally, but I find it to be really fascinating that, through that kind of work, you can actually talk about the specific linkages. I mean, neuroscience is something that obviously borders neuropsychology, but isn't
Yes.
quite in the same exact realm, although I've always been an admirer of neuroscience because it is so foundational to that relationship between mind and body. So as you're saying this now, it just makes me think so much about how when people are trying to understand their genealogy and their patterns and trying to link it to something more concrete, which I know that for some people that really helps them in their self-development. I can see the wide reaches of that kind of work and how it can be so beneficial.
Yeah, because then we don't have to blame anything or anybody. We can understand that there is a genetic constitution, and then we get into the whole conversation of DNA and the amazing things we're discovering about DNA, and how with the affirmations and the words we speak, we can either expand, heal our DNA, or further destroy it and deteriorate it. So it's a fascinating conversation. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. What's a fascinating, interesting, peculiar realization that you have around this intergenerational transmission of attachment style? Was there anything specific that caught your attention while you were writing about this, while you were researching this?
Well, I would say that so much of the work is not about blaming your parents or your grandparents, but just acknowledging that these patterns exist and then thinking about how you want to parent differently and how you want to relate differently. And sometimes people will say, well, this is kind of just how it is in my family. How am I supposed to break free of that? But I have personally helped people, even in their 60s and their 70s, break free from these intergenerational transmissions of attachment that haven't been healthy for them. So I think healing is possible at any age and stage. But I think even, again, when you look at online articles, social media, and how they talk about attachment, they almost liken it to a personality trait, like it's not going to change and it's kind of just how you are.
Exactly.
That's something I really think needs to be changed in terms of our conversations.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear you say that. That's music to my ears. Absolutely. If anything, I always liken it to being a part of a relay race. And this is your leg of the race. You're getting the baton. You get to decide when and how and what you do during this stretch of time to displace things that have perhaps afflicted you. Anyway, and especially as you see the connection, you can extend yourself and others grace, right?
Yeah,
We don't have to
absolutely.
be so harsh.
Yes.
In your latest book, The New Rules of Attachment, you discussed many interesting things, but for the sake of our listening audience, can you tell us what were the old rules and what are the new rules of attachment?
Yeah.
And can you briefly explain the new rules?
Yeah, definitely. So, the old rules are that attachment is kind of everlasting. It's not changeable. The old rules are that attachment shows up mostly in your romantic relationships. The old rules are, okay, this is my attachment style, so let's blame my parents, and we have to wait for my parents to come around to be able to do the work. The old rules are that, people with disorganized attachment especially are basically the worst of the worst. You can't really change them, and they have personality disorders, and it's too hard to figure them out, so we're not going to bother. We're just going to put them in this disorganized bucket and not really understanding what that means. And the new rules are, attachment is foundational to your sense of self. And so, of course, it's going to affect your romantic relationships, but it also affects your friendships, your family relationships, how you go about your mental and physical fitness and health goals, how you approach your career, whether or not you think you deserve good things in life first and foremost. And so really understanding that it's very comprehensive. Also understanding that attachment can be healed at any time, and you don't need your parents to be available to do the work with you. You can do the work yourself through reparenting your inner child. And then the disorganized attachment, this is not just simply a combination of the anxious and avoidant types. That's another new rule, which is that attachment isn't so categorical. There's a lot of people whose attachment will show up as anxious at work and then avoidant in their relationships, for example. And so it's important that we acknowledge that sometimes people will show more than one attachment style. And also, the disorganized attachment style is not a combination of the other styles. It's really something that's more seated in having a persistent fight or flight reaction to their life and being in chaos all the time. But it doesn't mean that people with disorganized attachment can't be helped. The work might be a little bit more treacherous, especially in the beginning, but I have seen people with disorganized attachment develop secure attachment at different ages in their lives.
I have to.
We have so many people that want to gift healing to their friends and family members. Due to popular request, we've officially created the Gift of Rest package for purchase. Please go to theplaceofrest.com/wholeness packages to view the Gift of Rest. If you've been listening to our podcast regularly and are now wondering, what's next, or how can I get more support? Our Day of Rest course is available to support you in your pilgrimage. Use the promo code PODCAST, all lowercase, to receive a 10% discount for our introductory Day of Rest course. Now back to the show.
I'm so thankful you laid it out so succinctly and clearly, because this is something practical that people can access by reading a book like your book. This is something they can get to work on immediately with themselves, their sphere of influence, their friends, their peers. This is a great discussion for a book club, right? Where everybody can begin to peel back the layers of the things that are derailing them. And I just really appreciate your work, because this does have a capacity, if we don't displace the ignorance around these themes and around these topics, this has the capacity to derail every area of a person's life.
Mm-hmm,
and
absolutely.
You're so right, because a person has a chaotic attachment style doesn't mean that they're marginalized for the rest of their life.
Yeah, exactly.
What, in your opinion, can people do to better understand their attachment styles? Do you have some practical suggestions, tools?
Yeah, so I actually have an attachment quiz that I developed, and you can access it for free on my website. That's a great way to know about your attachment styles, especially because in the quiz, I actually separate it into sections that relate to different areas of your life, your self-concept, your relationships, your family relationships, your career, and your job. And so you can also see where your insecure attachment, if you have that, is showing up mostly in which domains of your life. So that's a great way to get some understanding. Another way is, sometimes when you read a description about an attachment style, you'll sense that, well, this sounds like me. So I have a lot of this information for free on my social media and on my website as well. But of course, if you look at the book, you also can just read through the sections that describe the attachment styles and how it shows up in people's lives. And then you can see, well, does that sound like me or does that not sound like me? So that's a secondary way to confirm what your attachment style is.
That's wonderful. Have you seen people, for example, that can't afford counseling, especially in this crazy economy that we're in? Have you experienced that people can have success forming communities around discussions that explain, for example, how they love? Milan Yorkovich wrote a great book on attachment, How We Love. And I know there's a lot of conversation and community and gatherings around that book. Have you seen significant or heard of or get testimonies of people experiencing significant results from using your material in that way?
Yeah, I have actually kept in touch with a lot of people who I've worked with directly and seen their progress hold true over time, which I think is so helpful, that it's not just in the moment as you're doing the active work, that they're continuing to revisit the materials, especially because most of us, and I think this is an important part of this, is that if you have an insecure attachment that developed in childhood, you can definitely get to a place of secure attachment, but maybe during certain very stressful times, or if you come across one of your triggers, some shadows of your insecure attachment are going to creep back up again. But if you have the tools, you have the acknowledgement, first of all, that this is happening. But secondly, that, well, these tools worked and they will still work again. And so it's not so much to be afraid of that maybe some of these shadows can come up at other times. It's that you know how to manage and deal with it. And I think that that's true of anything, not just attachment styles, but also clinical symptoms. Like sometimes my patients who have depression will say, well, I'm so afraid that the depression is going to come back. It's like, okay, but if it does come back, you know exactly how to manage it now. But it can be hard sometimes for people to really relate that to actual success. You know, oh, well, if I'm completely healed, then why are my old patterns coming up? It's like, but you're a different version of you now, and you're resilient, and you're able to apply the rules and the strategies to be able to heal again. And so I think that that's been an important part of the experience. And it's an important part of what people have been telling me. It's like, okay, you know what? I noticed that my old attachment style was coming back up, and then I just applied the strategies, and I'm kind of back where I was when we finished our work. You know, I'm back to secure attachment again. And that's really rewarding to me.
That, and people become more aware, right, of the ramp up period. It doesn't blindside them as quickly or as easily.
Right.
Right. And
exactly.
don't you think that they also develop greater compassion and sensitivity for the people, the situation that they're dealing with, because they have a sense of compassion towards others, I think, and not so much judgment sometimes for themselves and the person they're engaging in. It's having information, right? People perish for lack of understanding, lack of knowledge of these things. In your work, what do you see as the barriers to healing?
I think the barriers are, you know, in relation to what you just mentioned, you know, people have such a hard time with giving compassion to themselves. So I think if there's a lot of self-judgment and a lot of self-hatred, you know, at the extreme, it's really hard to heal, to actually do the work and heal, because there may be a part of you that believes that you don't even deserve to have a better life. And there could also be a part of you that just thinks that you can't do it, that maybe it works for other people and doesn't work for you. And all of that goes back to not having self-compassion. And self-compassion is one of the hardest things to grasp, I think, for many people. We oftentimes use negative self-talk to punish ourselves, to try to motivate ourselves, but instead that just permeates into our subconscious and it becomes a part of what you really believe about yourself. And so I think that that's really the biggest barrier. And so in my book, I have a whole section just on self-compassion strategies, because I think that it's so important to have that before you even begin the work. So it's in the very early part of my book is, you know, before we actually get to the active part of the work, we really need to work on our self-compassion.
It's interesting because anger and unforgiveness came to mind. But anger, the root of anger is really pain.
Yeah.
And we feel pain. The root of our pain is often complicated, rooted in our attachments and our perceptions of what we're experiencing and all of that. So it's interesting because I think you were wise to put that much emphasis on how people see themselves, because the inclination is always to exercise judgment about situation and others instead of engagement, right, with self and saying, wait a minute, what's at odds within me? Am I perceiving this situation accurately? So basically you have observed that a significant barrier to healing has to do with how people see themselves, interact with themselves, and how they reason. Is there anything else that you think is also, have you observed besides a person's view of themselves and how they handle things and situations?
I think the other important aspect is that sometimes people will just avoid a lot of the self-development and the self-reflection because it feels painful to them. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that, of course, you know, in the beginning, self-acknowledgement can be a bit painful. It's not, if you're doing self-development work, right, it's not going to be happy, positive feelings all the time. but you have to really dig into the values that you have, for your life. What are your top values? And if one of your top values is to have stronger relationships, to feel more connected, to feel like your integrity with yourself, those things are worth experiencing some negative feelings to be able to pursue, right? And that's true of any meaningful pursuit in life. It's not all going to be happy all the time. When you think about starting a new job, creating your own business, moving across the country for a new opportunity, getting married, raising children, those are all very meaningful pursuits, and yet it never is a completely positive experience. And so
No.
just being able to recognize that and saying it's okay because the hard work means something to me in my life.
So good. In closing, I've observed, because it's been brought to my attention, that the more complex a situation I have to deal with, I find myself often saying, oh, good, good, while people were talking to me. And I just realize there's not a problem too big. There's not a situation that's too dark. There is not a dilemma too complicated that cannot be resolved. And regardless of the challenge and the difficulty of facing it, there is hope on the other side of that dilemma. What word of encouragement can you give to our listening audience as to why we can face problem situations with people with that attitude? Because I kind of sense you're this can-do person. And no, you're not enslaved by your heritage or the bleak situations that you were raised in, right? Your parents did everything they could with what they had at the time that you showed up. And now you get to do X, Y, and Z. But what words of encouragement can you give to people listening that are just practical and, wow, I've seen this, you can do that?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing that I can say to encourage people is that change doesn't happen overnight, but with every step that you take, you're going to notice a shift, not only in your own thinking, but also just your belief in yourself, that you are resilient and that you can do it. So sometimes I think people fast forward too quickly to what they think is supposed to be the end. And they're like, okay, well, I don't see how I'm going to get from here to here. But how I talk to some of my most severely depressed patients is you're not going to think about how this entire day is going to go. You're just going to think about what this next thing is that you're going to do. So then the next thing you're going to do is to sit up in bed. And that's it. That's all you're going to do. Once you've sat up in bed, then think about the next thing you're going to do. Okay, I'm going to, get out of bed. And that's it. I'm not going to think about what's after that. Okay, now that you're out of bed, what's the next thing you're going to do? And it's through that incremental change that real change happens. But I think that when people try to project all the way to the end, it feels too overwhelming to them. And then they get into this decision paralysis and they don't move at all.
Perfect closing thoughts. Be kind to yourself. Think incrementally and not about the whole process.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking just a little bit of time this morning to share your thoughts on attachment and your view of practical ways people can implement this. Thank you so very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Virginia, for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate you.
We hope listening to this episode has brought you closer to experiencing the freedom of wholeness and healing. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or for updates about R.E.S.T, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of R.E.S.T. If you would like more information about Virginia, or to support and join the cause of R.E.S.T, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to R.E.S.T with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.